All right. Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Frankie Flores. I am the director of the UNM LGBTQ Resource Center. We are so excited to have you here for our final installment of our Cafe Qs. Before I introduce our speaker, um, I want to give some love really to UNM Ajas, who has been holding it down with our Cafe Qs this semester. And we have our last one today. And I am super excited to introduce Luis Osvaldo Esparza, who is originally from Totlan, Jalisco, Mexico, but was raised in the Inland Empire region of California. He identifies as queer, Joto, Chicano, and most importantly, a social justice warrior. His experiences as a queer person of color have ultimately shaped the direction of his research. Much of his research is centered around decolonial theories and methodologies, that is, decentralizing European ways of knowing as universal knowledge and centering subaltern and indigenous epistemologies. He also focuses on rural queerness in Los Ranchos y los Pueblos, queer indigenous studies, and queer subversive complicity. He is a 2021 Apex Fellow and recipient of the CSUSB, the California State University of Santa Barbara, right?
I'm in
CS,
Ardino.
yeah, all right. 2020 College of Arts and Letters Outstanding Graduate Student Award. Please help me welcoming Luis.
Muchísimas gracias, Frankie. My name is Luis, and I'm part of the Chicana and Chicano Studies Department, PhD student here at UNM. And welcome to the last Cafe Q, which is Cultural Implications of El Pecado Nefando. And just a quick overview, this presentation is based on a paper that I wrote a year ago about how the Spaniards, how Europeans limited epistemologies of sexuality, how they kind of like imposed binary or Manichaean ways of thinking onto our indigenous ancestors. And I was trying to also break or the myth or the idea that homophobia is part of our cultura. Right? It's a homogenized the homogenized ways of thinking, where homophobia is part of and transphobia is part of our cultura, which is not true, you know. Okay, so the purpose is through an overview of historical documents provided by secondary sources, diaries, letters. This paper aims to deconstruct Mexican gay identity by unraveling visibility of indigenous MSM and two-spirit, as well as attitudes towards them. A homophobia against other hegemonic systems of oppression were imposed by the Iberian conquistadors and certain indigenous groups themselves. And the last section of this presentation will demonstrate how indigenous epistemology of plurality towards indigenous queerness of sexuality and gender have survived this imposition. So I just want to clear up some terminology I'm going to be using throughout this presentation. The first one is indigenismo, and I just want to differentiate the indigenismo I'm using compared to the one that's been used by the Mexican nation state to promote promote mestizaje and indigenismo that in fact invisibilizes indigenous communities in Mexico. And it's the indigenismo in the context of recovering our modos, indigenous ways of knowing, and not the indigenismo created by the Porfiriato to create homogenous national Mexican identity that reinforced the creation of a nation state. The second term is two-spirit, formerly Burdech. It's gender constructions and roles that occur in many indigenous communities outside the Western gender binary, as well as to Native people who are now reclaiming and redefining these roles with their respective communities. The next term is MSM, men who have sex with men, and do not always identify as gay or queer, which are terms that are created or stemmed or in the US. And the last term is sodomy. It's a way of pathologizing same-sex or non-reproductive intercourse by the conquistadores. So I just want to show some early accounts of MSM visibility within the 15th and 16th centuries. Michel del Cueno, and by the way, these are based on like diaries, which is one of the limitations of this is the paper that I wrote, right? Because it's based on accounts of conquistadores. And one of them was Michel de Cueno in 1495, where he witnessed sodomite behavior and argued that they were unaware of this vice. Bernal Diaz del Castillo, a Spanish conquistador, also reported witnessing sodomy inside temples themselves in the Valley of Mexico. And Cabeza de Vaca explicitly stated that he witnessed men getting married with other men in multiple accounts in 1534 and 1542. Francisco Gamora, a historian and ethnographer, made claims that certain provinces of the Aztec Empire were so tolerant of men who have sex with men, it allowed for existence of male brothels. Tajas and Sinaloa were also extremely tolerant of MSM because many of the records also point to sodomites existing in these lands. And sodomites, using sodomites as a term that was used during that time, right? I understand it's problematic now. And also accounts of two-spirit visibility. And one of these was Tememes, and where one of the accounts by the conquistadors said that Tememes were incredibly brave warriors. Nino Guzman, 1530, also testified to Chichimenca. Tememe he encountered was so brave, he was the last one captured by the Spaniards during a battle. Ninedo stated that, also another conquistador, Ninedo, stated that everyone was so amazed to see the heart and force of a woman, since we thought he was a woman's clothes that he wore. And we can see how the Spaniards are already like interpreting, even though they were like completely different epistemologies of gender and sexuality, the Spaniards were already like conceptualizing this phenomena through their binary lens. Pedro Castañeda stated that he encountered men dressed like women who marry other men and serve as their wives as well. Another conquistador who witnessed, who in a way provided visibility for these folks through these diaries. European epistemic impositions of sexuality and gender. So when the Europeans arrived in the 16th century, they began a long process of colonization that came with violence, rape, imposition of hierarchies. Some of these systems of power included racially divided systems of labor, class hierarchies, ethnic racial hierarchies based on racist taxonomies, and a gender hierarchy, sexual hierarchy, spiritual hierarchy, and epistemic hierarchy, which are all intermingled. Sodomy was the biggest justification for conquest. In essence, the Europeans justified the inferiority of the natives by demonizing homosexual practices or queer practices. The Spaniards referred to sodomy as a pecado nefando, a notorious sin. This was a sin so horrendous and barbaric, it was not even to be mentioned by name. The Spanish understanding of sodomy stems from early medieval times. A renowned theologian, Thomas Aquinas, was just, he's a saint right now, argued that nefarious sin could happen in several ways. First, by procuring pollution without any copulation for the sake of venereal pleasure. This pertains to the sin of uncleanness with some call effeminacy. Secondly, by copulation with the thing of undue species, and this is called bestiality. Thirdly, by copulation with an undue sex, male with male or female with female, as the apostle states, and this is called the vice of sodomy. So they kind of related. All of that was the Pecado Nefando. It entailed also bestiality, and it was all categorized under one. It was the religious way of pathologizing homosexuality. And these homophobic frameworks justified the laws developed to prosecute those who engage in this notorious sin. So the punishment for Pecado Nefando was stoning, castration, and burning. King Manuel and Queen Elizabeth Medina of Spain in 1497 declared that those who committed the Pecado Nefando shall be burned at the stake. The most notorious case was the case of La Cotita, as well, that's what they prefer to be called, but their legal name was Juan de la Vega. And the story goes that La Cotita they were dressed in what we, code as like women's clothing, and they would invite men to their home, and they would they would engage in intercourse. They would be fully queer, and en ese tiempo es como si fuera queer, right? And what happened was la vendedora, someone a washer woman, caught Juan de la Vega or La Cotita with another man in the bushes, and she was so scandalized that she, called the Spanish crown to arrest Juan de la Vega. And on the 16th of November in 1568, La Cortita, along with 12 other men, were burned at the stake, accused of a Pecado Nefando. And this kind of like raised a hunt for folks or for folks who committed el Pecado Nefando. So as you can see, this rhetoric was instrumental towards limiting and also making us ourselves feel ashamed of our bodies, right? The era of the Inquisition, the era of the colonial era, it was instrumental. The rhetoric of those eras, which stemmed from European ways of knowing, was instrumental to colonizing our bodies, right? And making us feel ashamed of our sexuality, of our gender. And I pulled this quote from indigenous scholar who quoted an elder about how our bodies have been colonized. A lot of elders that I work with say that you can actually tell how colonized we are as a people by the knowledge about our bodies that we've lost. The fact that we need systems and institutions and books to tell us things about our own bodies is a real problem. What better way to colonize our people than to make them ashamed, to make us ashamed of our bodies? Also, I want to make clear that certain indigenous groups also did punish MSM. Anas and Gamboa cite Juan de Torquemada wrote about the treatment of Aztec priests when they had illicit sex. If they were caught with women, they'd be taken away and be exiled. However, if the priests were having sex with men, he would be burned and hung. There's also laws of punishment applied to royalty as well. King Nezacotzin, the folk who's listed in the 100 peso bill, in fact, he had a son who was also caught. He was considered brave and courageous and was accused of nefarious crime and executed. And his father ratified his punishment. He was so repulsed that he declared that those who committed such deed deserved to die. Nezacotzin passed laws where tops or actives, those who engaged penetrated, would be burned alive, and passive bottoms had their entrails removed. So in this slide, I just kind of want to highlight that I don't want to essentialize that all indigenous groups were tolerant towards MSM or queer folk. There were also those who did, fortunately punish queer folks as well. So we cannot essentialize. Taylor argues that although the Mexica politically dominated many indigenous groups, they allow them to keep their cultural practices. Taylor argues that this includes sexual practices as well, that indigenous pluralism exists, is a rich diversity of customs and attitudes, including attitudes about sexuality that still exists today. There's a great deal of homosexuality and bisexuality in both the Gulf and Pacific coastal regions of Mexico before the conquest. So there's evidence that, that there's certain groups that did, tolerate or embrace homosexuality or queerness in their practices. One of Taylor's respondents from Veracruz, who learned a saying as a child, "It is good luck to have," I don't want to say the word, in the family. The plurality of indigenous perspectives on queerness may never be completely known, but Sanchez argues that the invasion of what is known as Mexico by the Spanish colonizers did much to limit the plurality of indigenous perspectives on queerness. So there's clearly been a lot of subversive complicity with certain groups, and what subversive complicity is resistance from within. We're working on and against systems of domination. And despite different waves of domination, colonialism, cultural imposition of the Mexican nation state, and neoliberalism, certain indigenous groups have managed to rescue and uphold the understandings of sexuality and gender. For example, the Muxes of Yutichan, who are considered indigenous third gender, they have done this by maintaining their traditional attire and refraining from subscribing to Western hegemonic aesthetics and understandings of sexuality and gender. Moving on. Some limitations from this presentation, from this paper that I wrote, is that many of the diaries and accounts were in through a Catholic and Eurocentric framework, and the majority of indigenous codices were wiped out during La Conquista. And I just wanted to highlight that I'm actually in the process of researching some codices, some indigenous codices of queer deities from the Aztec Empire. And also looking at um, other indigenous groups from the Caribbean who have also had evidence that they also believed in plurality and gender and sexuality as well. Pero that's it. That's my presentation. Gracias. Que viva la jotería. Thank you so much. If you have any questions, feel free to post them in the chat.
All right, thank you so much for that. Pico, do we have any questions that were coming through?
No, it does not look like we have any questions in the chat. But actually, Luis, let me ask you a question.
Okay.
So you talk about the sentiments of queerness in pre-colonial and colonial Mexico. Can you kind of talk about it, kind of in like current times of how not only how Mexicans see queerness, but whether or not you've seen like a change within like the past like 10 years of like our culture being a little bit like more accepting of like the LGBTQ community?
Sí. So, in terms of indigenous studies, I did look at a book called it's called Queer Indigenous Studies by Driscoll. And I know there's like a movement within indigenous queer studies to kind of like reclaim like knowledges through like oral histories, right? Or through stories that were passed down. That's one of the ways that indigenous folks are trying to reclaim that, right? Reclaim like their ways of knowing pre-conquest. And in terms of today, for I guess lack of a better word, contemporary like Mexicanos, research I've done, particularly here in the rural parts of Mexico, I say there's more like acceptance, pero at the same time we cannot ignore that like the nation state still kind of the Mexican nation state, they still uphold like violence. They in fact, I think last week there was a folk who died here in Guadalajara. They were killed by the police. So I feel like maybe there is like a cultural shift happening to undo these impositions. But I feel like we still have like a long way to go before we can, folks can clearly, be freely accepted.
I have a question. So when we look at Spain and New Spain documents, right, the language is always very sterile, and they read kind of like as police reports, essentially. So how do you use those to read against the grain and look for stories that aren't just based in sin or in punishment?
Can you repeat the question, Frankie?
Yeah. So when we're looking at documents like court records from Spain and New Spain, where they're persecuting homosexuals, sodomites, they're read in a very clinical. I mean, it's words like sodomites, right? And they talk about it as a sin, but not as something that people are engaging in that is romantic relationships possibly. So how do you read against the grain to find those stories that are larger than just the action?
I'm thinking about Emma Perez's Decolonial Imaginary, and she kind of argues that we kind of have to look at those like documents, right, to kind of like build, like try to unravel like the stories of that, like, the stories of those folks. And one of the things that I'm kind of training myself to do, and also like trying to get training for, is looking at quizás los códices, because maybe those documents, the Spanish documents, they're a little too like you said, they're a little too like coded with like very strong like violent language against folks who might be like, or who were queer at that time. But I guess I guess maybe these documents can serve as like a way of like citations, right? Like by citing and saying, hey, these folks did exist, and you know they did yeah, they did exist at that time, right? Like pre-conquest.
Yeah.
Mhm.
Great, thank you.
Gracias.
So it looks like there's no more questions. But yeah, thank you so much for Luis for that discussion. We appreciate your scholarship. And I think that wraps up our Catholic Qs for this semester.
Yep. Thank you so much.
Gracias.